Hi there, and welcome back to English 75A. Today we'll be looking at American literature, 1700 to 1820, and also at Jonathan Edwards, the last of the great Puritan thinkers. For our discussion this week, I'm asking you to take a look at our reading from Crèvecoeur, a Frenchman who comes to the United States, or rather to what will be the United States, and writes one of the most important early texts about the American scene and the American nature. We'll also be looking at Benjamin Franklin, in some ways a very contemporary thinker and still a very influential thinker among the founding fathers. And I'm going to ask you to think about what kinds of connections you see between him and his work, the way he writes, his style, and how that relates to how we work and think and operate, and also what we think about in the contemporary American lives that we live. So let's start by talking about the really important changes that are happening in what will become the United States of America during this period. And all of this is going to ripple through literature. First of all, we've got this amazing exponential colonial growth during this period. I know I'm throwing in a math term there, but it certainly isn't a line, right? It's not a straight line. It's not a y equals mx plus b. It's at an exponential rate. Don't know if my visual really helped there. So in 1670, there are, about 111,000 colonists. By the time we hit 1700, we're talking 30 years later, it more than doubles. That is a huge increase, and it speaks to the rapid changes that are happening in the organization of the colonies, and also their growing awareness of themselves as something different than Britain. So they're beginning to think of themselves with a completely different identity than just as subjects or an outgrowth of England and of the English or British Empire. Super important stuff. Part of this growth is fueled through slavery. There's no doubt about that. And that's an important facet for us to keep in mind. Slavery does help to propel a lot of the growth that's happening during this period. It made a lot of wealth for a lot of very already wealthy merchants, but it also helped expand other people in artisanal classes. If you think about people who are making candles, for example, a lot of them were making candles to help keep slaves working at night. If you think about people like blacksmiths, a lot of the work related to smithy businesses had to do with either the work of slaves or with keeping slaves in line and subjugated. Manacles, shackles, chains, those kinds of things. So all of these different elements do really link back to slavery in one way or another. And if you're interested in learning more about this subject, especially if you want to be an educator, but if you just want to learn more, there's a fantastic podcast one of my colleagues turned me on to called Teaching Hard History. And it just talks about how the economy of slavery permeated practically every other economic niche in the New World. And we've also got the transatlantic trade growing at a rapid rate. Europe, Africa, South America, and the Caribbean are all connecting more and more and more. There's this drive for wealth, but there's also this drive for the substances and local resources that those places could procure. A lot of you already know about the triangle trade with slaves, molasses, and rum, and that's certainly part of it. And of course, the Native Americans during this time, as a result of colonial growth, are further displaced. A lot of their neighborhoods and their locales destroyed or taken over by the Brits. We saw that happening even earlier when we read Mary Rowlandson and her narrative of captivity. That was a direct result of King Philip's War, waged by the Wampanoag. King Philip, of course, being Metacomet um, to the Wampanoag. And the important thing to remember there is that, it was the colonialists, or the colonists rather, continuing to encroach and push them back. There's a nice little piece from Chief Metacomet, or King Philip, where he is actually speaking to the British about why they're doing what they're doing, and it's a plea for peace. It's very reasonable. And finally, we've got this distinctively American culture emerging, and a lot of those threads and those notions are still with us today. So that's going to be important for us to keep on the lookout for. Less like colonists, more like Americans, more like early Americans. And we can't really go any farther without talking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a revolution of thinking, and it's also a revolution of spirituality and religion and science that occurs in the early 1700s. And this is going to change the way people think about themselves, about their world, about how to be a good person, how to be a pious or religious person, and how to solve problems within the world, whether they be social problems or economic problems. Well, we've got Isaac Newton's laws of physics, and these are really important. They seem really, really basic to us now. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. The universal speed of gravity. All of these things bring some important points to people in the 1700s. And that is that the universe is an orderly system, that there are ways in which things work that can be predicted. And from those predictions, we can make hypotheses, we can test the system further. And once we understand those natural laws, people can then make predictions about how to better work with their environment and work with those scientific laws in the future. It really revs up scientific discovery. Before people really bought on to Isaac Newton's laws of physics, the whole idea was that, well, there was the universe, and what happens because of God's will. Because God's will. End of story. Newton's saying, hey, we can use reason, we can use logic in order to figure out the natural world and to use that knowledge to be better as a people, as a community, as a nation, in treating each other and solving problems that concern us all. And I went over that point. I try not to blow past the bullet points, but I do it quite a bit. Yeah, human reason allows for predictability of the physical world. And here, we've got a nice example. This is an engraving called Flayed Body from the tables of the skeleton and the muscles of the human body. Now, this wasn't done by an American, but this tells you what kind of refocus that we have at this point on studying the human body and how you study the human body. Notice how detailed this is. Notice how this differs from, say, what you might see as Renaissance or medieval representations of the body. There's a real focus put onto detail and to being as accurate as possible. Now, before the scientific revolution, which also became a medical revolution, dealing with medicine was very, very different. You've got the Royal Medical Society of London, and basically, before the scientific revolution, what they would do is they would read from old texts, neoclassical, actually classical texts from an ancient Greek physician named Galen. And what they would do is they would read these texts, they would lecture on them, they'd talk about them, maybe they'd point to somewhere on a picture, and that would be it. The scientific method makes people want to actually get in there and find out how the body works. So dissection comes back. Even vivisection, as grotesque as it is, comes back. William Harvey was the first British doctor to prove that the heart actually pumped blood around this time. Before that, they weren't really sure what it did. They weren't really sure what the blood was doing in the body. There was a popular theory that the blood was being produced by the heart and not from the inside of our bones, as we know now, and that it continued out through our tiny little veins and evaporated out of our fingertips and out of our skin. But by using the scientific method and measuring blood that was coming out of the body and those kinds of experiments, it changed rapidly. We see other scientific experiments relating to electricity. And, of course, everybody knows the Benjamin Franklin anecdote about the kite and the key. But think about how important this is going to be in the future here to understand how to make electricity work. This is a real strange setup here, but it looks like they're trying to generate static electricity on the subject that is hanging there from those ropes. And you can see it in the little spark over here on what looks to be either like a metal wand or perhaps a pad of some kind. And I know it kind of looks like a magic wand or something like that. And again, these might seem really rudimentary and silly to us, but electricity wasn't even known back then the way we know it now. The other really big important point to think about when it comes to the Enlightenment is John Locke, the political philosopher, and his writings. He comes up with this idea in his writing that human sympathy is the basis for a moral life. Showing compassion to others, treating others the way you'd want to be treated, is the way that you act as a moral person. And this goes completely against that idea of divine grace. And in a way, this is pushing way back against that Puritan and Calvinist worldview, which says that either you've got God's grace or you don't. Either you're going to heaven and God's already determined it, or you don't. Nothing you can do to change that. But Locke pretty much comes up with this idea and makes it more popular that what you do and how you act to other people is at the foundation for being a good person and even a holy and a pious person. Big difference. Human sympathy. And coming along with that idea is that the human mind can make decisions that are rational and socially beneficial. In other words, social problems can be solved, lessened, mitigated by putting our minds together and working together to cooperate. That's not to say that Locke didn't believe in God, but he believed in the power of the mind that was bestowed by a divine being in order to help people be good to each other. And again, this is very, very different. And you can already see how maybe this is challenging the power structures that be. Yeah, maybe this whole idea of God being inside one person called the king or the queen isn't really the whole deal. And finally, Locke's emphasis on reason, rational thinking, logic, they're all related terms, culminates in this notion that belief that we should have a belief in God, that he works in a reasonable and comprehensible way. Not that there was some divine mystery out there somewhere and it's his will and that's all we know. People use that pretty selectively anyway. If good things happen to good people, a lot of people at the time would say, oh, that's God's will. If bad things happen to bad people, they would say, oh, that's God's will. If good things happen to bad people, it's a divine mystery. If good things happen to bad people or bad things happen to good people, that too a divine mystery. So there's a whole revolution in thinking about spirituality, religion, and relating to other people. Oh, and we also get neoclassicism in art, literature, and architecture. a callback to a lot of the ideas um, in Greek and Roman society from way back when.